Imagine a boy born on a tiny island that had just become French. He spoke with a strange accent, was mocked by his classmates, and stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall. And yet this outsider would crown himself emperor, redraw the map of Europe, and shake the foundations of the entire world. This is Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican who conquered an empire. Before we drift off into the story, leave a like and comment where you are listening from so others can find their way here too. Now let us journey back to the Age of Revolution to discover how one man's ambition changed history forever. The story of Napoleon begins not in the grand palaces of Paris, but on a rugged Mediterranean island called Corsica. This small mountainous land had been an independent republic for 14 years under its own leader, a man named Pasquale Paoli. The Corsican people were fiercely proud of their freedom. They had fought hard against the Republic of Genoa, which had once ruled them. But in 1768, just 1 year before Napoleon was born, Genoa sold the island to the Kingdom of France. The French army arrived to take control of their new possession. The Corsicans, led by Paoli, resisted with everything they had. They were a people of rugged mountains and ancient family loyalties. They did not want to become French subjects. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a young lawyer from a minor noble family. He had fought alongside Paoli in the resistance against the French invasion. His wife Letizia was a strong and determined woman who was pregnant with Napoleon during some of the fiercest fighting. Legend says she was even present at a battle while carrying him. But the Corsican resistance was doomed. The French army was too powerful. In 1769, the same year Napoleon was born, the Corsicans were finally and completely defeated. Pasquale Paoli fled into exile in England. Carlo Bonaparte, ever the pragmatist, made a fateful decision. He chose to accept French rule and cooperate with the new masters of his island. This choice would change the course of history. On August 15th, 1769, in the town of Ajaccio, Letizia gave birth to her second surviving child. They named him Napoleone di Bonaparte in the Italian style. He was a small and sickly infant in a large and growing family. Letizia would eventually bear 13 children, though only 8 survived to adulthood. The Bonaparte household was not wealthy, but it was respectable. They lived in a modest townhouse in Ajaccio. Carlo worked hard to improve the family's standing under the new French administration. He had his family's noble status officially recognised by the French, which opened doors for his children. His greatest ambition was to give his sons an education that would lift them into the French elite. When Napoleon was 9 years old, his life changed forever. His father had secured him a scholarship to a military school in mainland France. In 1778, the young boy left his beloved Corsica for the first time. He crossed the sea to a foreign country, whose language he barely spoke. He was enrolled at a preparatory school in the town of Autumn to learn proper French before attending the military academy. Imagine this small boy surrounded by the sounds of an unfamiliar language, far from his mother and the sun-drenched hills of his home. He was alone in a strange and often hostile world. This early experience of isolation and being an outsider would shape his character for the rest of his life. After a few months of intensive language study, Napoleon was sent to the Royal Military School at Brienne. This was a school for the sons of the French nobility, a world of rigid discipline and aristocratic privilege. Here, the young Corsican boy faced constant ridicule. His classmates mocked his strange accent, his foreign name, and his unfashionable clothes. They called him the Corsican, treating him as an outsider and a barbarian from a conquered land. Napoleon was proud and sensitive. He did not take these insults lightly. He became withdrawn and solitary, preferring the company of books to the company of his peers. He threw himself into his studies, particularly mathematics, history, and geography. He devoured books about the great military commanders of antiquity, men like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. At Brienne, Napoleon discovered his passion for artillery. The study of cannons and ballistics was a field that rewarded mathematical skill and technical knowledge. It was less dominated by the old aristocratic families who preferred the glamour of the cavalry. For a poor outsider with a sharp mind, it was the perfect path to advancement. He spent 5 years at Brienne, a period that hardened him and sharpened his ambition. He graduated in 1784 and won a place at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, the most elite military academy in France. He was only 15 years old, He completed the 2-year course in just 1 year, graduating as a second lieutenant of artillery in 1785. His childhood of poverty and mockery was behind him. His career as a soldier had begun. The young Lieutenant Bonaparte was assigned to an artillery regiment stationed in the south of France. His early years as an officer were uneventful and frustrating. He was poor and often had to send money home to support his family. His father, Carlo, had died of stomach cancer in 1785, leaving the family in a difficult financial position. Napoleon spent much of his time reading and writing. He produced essays on a wide range of subjects and even began writing a history of Corsica, a sign that his heart still belonged to his native island. He remained an outsider, a junior officer with big dreams and no opportunities. But the world around him was about to be turned upside down. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted. The storming of the Bastille prison in Paris on July 14th sent shockwaves across Europe. The old order of kings and nobles was being torn apart by the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. For a young, ambitious officer like Napoleon, the revolution was a disaster and an opportunity rolled into one. The old aristocratic officer corps began to collapse. Many noble officers fled the country or were dismissed. This created a sudden and desperate need for talented military leaders who were loyal to the new revolutionary government. For a man of proven ability but humble origins, the doors of advancement were suddenly thrown wide open. Napoleon initially watched the revolution from the sidelines. He even returned to Corsica for a time, hoping to play a role in its politics. He had once admired Pasquale Paoli and dreamed of Corsican independence. But the situation on the island became chaotic and dangerous. Napoleon and his family found themselves on the wrong side of a political struggle. In 1793, they were forced to flee Corsica as refugees, their home burned by their enemies. The Bonapartes escaped to mainland France with almost nothing. It was a traumatic moment, but it severed Napoleon's ties to his homeland forever. From this moment on, he was no longer a Corsican dreaming of his island's freedom. He was a Frenchman with nothing to lose and everything to gain. The revolutionary government was now fighting for its survival. France was at war with almost every major power in Europe. Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic had all formed a coalition to crush the revolution and restore the French monarchy. Inside France, the country was also tearing itself apart. In the south, the great port city of Toulon had revolted against the revolutionary government. The rebels had invited in a British fleet, which now occupied the harbour. Toulon was one of France's most important naval bases. Its loss was a catastrophe. The revolutionary army laid siege to the city, but they could not break through. It was here at the siege of Toulon, in 1793, that the young Napoleon Bonaparte would finally get his chance. Napoleon arrived at the siege as a captain of artillery. He had been sent to replace an officer who had been wounded. He quickly assessed the situation and saw what the senior commanders had missed. The key to recapturing Toulon was not a direct assault on the city walls. It was to capture a specific fort that overlooked the harbour. If the French could place their cannons on that high ground, they could rain fire down on the British fleet. The British would be forced to withdraw and the city would fall. Napoleon drew up a detailed plan and presented it to the commanding general. His boldness and clarity impressed his superiors. He was given command of the artillery for the assault. The attack on the fort was fierce and bloody. Napoleon himself led his men in the final charge. He had a horse shot out from under him and was wounded in the thigh by an enemy bayonet. But his plan worked perfectly. The fort was captured. The French cannons were hauled up to the heights and opened fire on the British ships below. Just as Napoleon had predicted, the fleet was forced to evacuate the harbour. Without the protection of the British Navy, the city of Toulon surrendered. Napoleon was hailed as the hero of the siege. He was promoted from captain to brigadier general almost overnight. He was only 24 years old. The unknown Corsican outsider had announced his arrival on the stage of history. The fall of Toulon saved the revolution in the south, but the revolution itself was devouring its own children. This was the period known as the Terror, when the radical faction led by Maximilien Robespierre sent thousands of people to the guillotine. Anyone suspected of being an enemy of the revolution could be arrested and executed. Napoleon kept his head down during this dangerous time, but he had powerful patrons who were close to Robespierre. When Robespierre himself was overthrown and executed in July of 1794, Napoleon's associations made him briefly suspect. He was even arrested and imprisoned for a short time. His career seemed to be over before it had truly begun. But the chaos of the revolution meant that fortunes could change as quickly as the wind. By 1795, the revolutionary government was weak and unpopular. A new constitution had created a ruling body called the Directory. It was constantly threatened by both royalist conspirators who wanted to restore the king and radical Jacobins who wanted to return to the terror. In October of 1795, a royalist mob rose up in Paris. They marched on the seat of government, threatening to overthrow the Directory by force. The government was desperate for a general who could defend them. They turned to Napoleon Bonaparte. He had a reputation for decisive action, and he was available. He was given command of the troops defending the government. What followed became one of the most famous moments of his early career. The royalist crowd, numbering in the thousands, advanced through the streets of Paris. Napoleon positioned his cannons at key intersections. When the mob approached, he gave the order to fire. The cannons blasted grapeshot, a hail of small metal balls directly into the crowd. The effect was devastating. The mob was shattered in minutes. Napoleon later described this event with chilling simplicity. He said he had given them a whiff of grapeshot. The insurrection was crushed. The Directory was saved, and Napoleon Bonaparte, the saviour of the government, was rewarded with command of the army of Italy. He was 26 years old and about to embark on the campaign that would make him a legend. The army of Italy in 1796 was a ragged and demoralised force. The soldiers were poorly fed, poorly clothed, and had not been paid in months. They were facing the powerful Austrian Empire and its allies in northern Italy. Previous French commanders had achieved little. Napoleon arrived at headquarters with a burning ambition to change everything. He immediately set about inspiring his men with fiery speeches. He promised them glory, honour, and the riches of Italy. He told them that they were the instruments of destiny. His energy and confidence were infectious. The demoralised army began to believe in itself again. Napoleon's Italian campaign was a masterpiece of speed and surprise. The Austrians and their allies, the Kingdom of Sardinia, expected a slow and cautious advance. Instead, Napoleon struck with lightning speed. He divided the enemy forces with a series of rapid marches and attacked them separately before they could unite. In a matter of weeks, he won a string of stunning victories. He knocked the Kingdom of Sardinia out of the war entirely, forcing them to sign a humiliating peace. He then turned his full attention to the Austrians. City after city fell to the French army. Milan, the great capital of Lombardy, opened its gates. The treasures and wealth of Italy began to flow back to Paris. Napoleon was no longer just a successful general. He was becoming a political force in his own right. During this dazzling campaign, Napoleon also found time for love. Before leaving for Italy, he had met a woman named Josephine de Beauharnais. She was a widow, 6 years older than him, with 2 children from her first marriage. She was charming, elegant, and well-connected in Parisian society. Napoleon fell for her with an almost obsessive passion. He wrote her long and emotional letters from the front, pouring out his heart in a way that seems almost out of character for such a calculating man. They were married in a hasty civil ceremony in March of 1796, just 2 days before he left to take command of the army. Josephine would become the great love of his life, though their relationship would be stormy and ultimately tragic. The Italian campaign continued through 1796 and into 1797. Napoleon proved himself to be not just a brilliant battlefield commander, but also a shrewd political operator. He negotiated treaties, reorganised Italian states, and sent vast amounts of looted treasure and art back to France. He began to act less like a general following orders, and more like an independent ruler. The Directory in Paris grew nervous about their ambitious young commander, but they needed his victories too much to rein him in. In October of 1797, Napoleon forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio. It was a peace dictated on his terms, not those of his government. The first great coalition against revolutionary France had been broken. Napoleon returned to Paris as a conquering hero, the most famous and popular man in France. But Napoleon knew that a hero who sat idle would soon be forgotten. He needed a new stage for his ambition. He proposed to the Directory a bold and exotic plan, an expedition to Egypt. The official goal was to strike at British power by threatening their trade routes to India. But for Napoleon, it was also an adventure, a chance to walk in the footsteps of Alexander the Great. The Directory was happy to send their dangerously popular general far away from Paris. In May of 1798, Napoleon set sail from Toulon with a massive fleet carrying nearly 40,000 soldiers and a small army of scientists, scholars, and artists. He was embarking on one of the strangest chapters of his career. The expedition began with a spectacular success. Napoleon's fleet evaded the British Navy and landed in Egypt. He captured the city of Alexandria with little resistance. He then marched his army across the scorching desert towards Cairo. On July 21, 1798, his army met the main Egyptian force, a cavalry army of the Mamluks, near the pyramids of Giza. Napoleon is said to have pointed to the ancient monuments and told his men that 40 centuries of history were looking down upon them. The battle was a total French victory. The undisciplined Mamluk cavalry charges were shattered by disciplined French infantry squares and devastating artillery fire. Cairo fell to Napoleon, and he was master of Egypt, but the triumph was short-lived. Just over a week after the Battle of the Pyramids, the British Navy finally caught up with the French fleet. It was anchored in Abu Qir Bay near Alexandria. On August 1, 1798, a British fleet under the command of Admiral Horatio Nelson attacked. The Battle of the Nile was a catastrophe for France. Nelson's ships sailed around the anchored French fleet and destroyed it almost completely. The French flagship exploded in a massive fireball. Napoleon's army was now stranded in Egypt, with no way home. They were cut off from France, trapped in a hostile land, thousands of miles from home. Napoleon tried to make the best of the situation. He attempted to administer Egypt, introducing reforms and trying to win over the local population. He led his army on a grueling and ultimately failed campaign north into Syria. He besieged the fortress of Acre, but could not capture it. Disease, particularly the plague, ravaged his troops. The expedition was slowly turning into a disaster. But throughout this time, Napoleon also sponsored important scientific and scholarly work. The scientists and scholars he had brought with him studied the ancient monuments of Egypt and catalogued its plants and animals. Most famously, one of his soldiers discovered a broken slab of black stone near the town of Rosetta. This Rosetta Stone, with its inscriptions in 3 different scripts, would eventually unlock the secrets of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. While Napoleon was stranded in Egypt, the situation in Europe had changed dramatically. A new coalition of powers, including Britain, Austria, and Russia, had formed against France. The Directory's armies were suffering defeats on multiple fronts. The government in Paris was weak, corrupt, and deeply unpopular. France was in crisis. Napoleon, ever the opportunist, sensed his moment had come. In August of 1799, he made a fateful decision. He would abandon his army in Egypt and return to France to seize power. Leaving his troops under the command of a subordinate, he slipped past the British naval blockade and sailed for home. It was an act of cold calculation. The army he left behind would eventually be forced to surrender to the British. But for Napoleon, they had served their purpose. Napoleon landed in France in October of 1799. He found the country in exactly the state of crisis he had hoped for. The Directory was collapsing. Several influential politicians, including a man named Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, were already plotting to overthrow it. They needed a popular general to provide the military muscle for their coup. Napoleon was the obvious choice. He quickly joined the conspiracy. On November 9, 1799, the coup was launched. Napoleon and his co-conspirators forced the 2 legislative councils to relocate outside Paris under the pretext of a Jacobin conspiracy. The next day, Napoleon entered the council chamber with a squad of grenadiers to demand they dissolve and hand over power. The initial confrontation was chaotic. Some deputies shouted and even physically attacked Napoleon. For a moment, the coup seemed to be failing. But Napoleon's brother, Lucien, who was president of one of the councils, saved the day. He rallied the soldiers outside, telling them the deputies were trying to assassinate their general. The grenadiers stormed the chamber and drove out the deputies at bayonet point. The Directory was finished. The French Revolution, in its original form, was over. A new government was quickly established. It was called the Consulate, and it was led by 3 consuls. Napoleon was named first consul. The title was modest, but the power was not. Within a few short years, Napoleon would accumulate all power into his own hands. The other 2 consuls became mere figureheads. A new constitution was drafted that gave the first consul almost dictatorial authority. It was submitted to a popular vote, a plebiscite, which approved it by an overwhelming margin. The French people, exhausted by a decade of revolution, chaos and war, were willing to trade liberty for stability. They had given their consent to the rule of one man. Napoleon was now the undisputed master of France. He was only 30 years old. Napoleon's first priority, as first consul, was to end the wars that were bleeding France dry. The Second Coalition was still fighting, and Austrian armies were threatening France's northern Italian territories. In the spring of 1800, Napoleon led a new army over the Alps into Italy in a dramatic and dangerous crossing. He surprised the Austrians and met them in battle at the village of Marengo on June 14th. The battle was nearly a disaster. The Austrians pushed the French back, and Napoleon was close to defeat. But at the crucial moment, French reinforcements arrived and launched a devastating counterattack. The Austrian army was routed. The Battle of Marengo secured Napoleon's grip on power. Combined with other French victories, it forced Austria to sue for peace. The Treaty of Luneville in 1801 ended the war on the continent. A year later, even Britain agreed to a temporary peace at the Treaty of Amiens. For the first time in a decade, all of Europe was at peace. With peace secured, Napoleon turned his enormous energy to reforming France. He was not just a military genius, he was also a brilliant administrator with a vision for a modern, efficient state. His most lasting achievement was the Civil Code, which came to be known as the Napoleonic Code. It was a complete overhaul of French law. It swept away the chaotic patchwork of feudal customs and royal edicts that had governed France for centuries. In its place, it established a single, clear, and uniform set of laws for all citizens. The Code enshrined the principles of the Revolution. It guaranteed equality before the law, freedom of religion, and the right to own property. It abolished the last vestiges of feudalism. At the same time, it was also a conservative document. It strengthened the authority of the father within the family and did little to advance the rights of women. The Napoleonic Code would be adopted, or in whole or in part, by dozens of countries around the world. It remains the foundation of the legal systems in much of Europe and Latin America to this day. Napoleon's reforms extended far beyond the law. He reorganised the chaotic French educational system, creating a network of state-run secondary schools called lycées to train a new generation of administrators and officers. He established the Bank of France to stabilise the nation's finances. He negotiated a concordat with the Pope, healing the rift between the revolutionary state and the Catholic Church. He created the Legion of Honour, a system of merit-based awards designed to reward talent and service, regardless of birth. In everything he did, Napoleon sought to create a rational, efficient, and centralised state. He believed that France should be governed by the most talented men, chosen for their ability, not their ancestry. This principle, known as the career open to talents, was at the heart of his vision. The peace Napoleon had won did not last long. Britain was deeply suspicious of French power and refused to give up its strategic gains. Napoleon, for his part, was restless and ambitious. He continued to expand French influence in Europe and around the world. Tensions escalated. In May of 1803, Britain declared war, and the long struggle resumed. This new conflict would dominate the rest of Napoleon's career. It would pit him against a seemingly endless series of coalitions, funded by British gold and determined to destroy him. Napoleon's response was to prepare for an invasion of Britain itself. He assembled a massive army, the Grande Armée, on the coast of the English Channel. Thousands of flat-bottomed boats were built to carry his soldiers across the narrow strait. All he needed was control of the sea for a few days. But the British Royal Navy was the most powerful in the world. Admiral Horatio Nelson, the hero of the Nile, was determined to stop Napoleon. The French and Spanish fleets were ordered to break out of their ports and clear the channel for the invasion. Instead, they were hunted down and brought to battle off the coast of Spain near a cape called Trafalgar. On October 21st, 1805, Nelson's fleet attacked. The Battle of Trafalgar was a decisive and total British victory. The combined French and Spanish fleet was destroyed. Nelson himself was killed by a sniper during the battle, dying as a national hero. The invasion of Britain was now impossible. Napoleon would never cross the Channel. He was forced to abandon his camps on the coast and turn his attention back to the continent. Just weeks before Trafalgar, Napoleon had already pivoted to face a new threat on land. Austria and Russia had joined Britain to form the Third Coalition. A large Austrian army had invaded Bavaria. a French ally. Napoleon responded with one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. He wheeled his Grande Armée away from the Channel coast and marched it at incredible speed across Europe. In a series of lightning manoeuvres, he surrounded an entire Austrian army at the city of Ulm and forced it to surrender without a major battle. Over 30,000 Austrian soldiers laid down their arms. Napoleon then marched east to confront the main Russian and Austrian armies. The climax came on December 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation as emperor. He had crowned himself Emperor of the French in a lavish ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris the year before. He had taken the crown from the hands of the Pope and placed it on his own head, a powerful symbol that he owed his power to no one but himself. Now, exactly 1 year later, he would win his greatest victory. The armies met near the town of Austerlitz, in what is now the Czech Republic. Napoleon faced a combined Russian and Austrian force that outnumbered him. The two emperors, Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria, were present on the battlefield. Napoleon lured them into a trap. He deliberately weakened his right flank, tempting the enemy to attack it. When they did, he launched a devastating assault on their weakened centre. His troops stormed the Pratzen Heights and split the Allied army in two. The enemy flanks were then rolled up and destroyed. Thousands of Allied soldiers were drowned when they fled across a frozen lake, and Napoleon ordered his cannons to shatter the ice beneath them. The Battle of Austerlitz was a masterpiece, perhaps the most perfect victory Napoleon ever won. It shattered the Third Coalition. Austria was forced to sign a humiliating peace, giving up vast territories. The ancient Holy Roman Empire, a political structure that had existed for over 800 years, was dissolved. In its place, Napoleon created the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of German states under French protection. Russia retreated, licking its wounds. Napoleon was now the undisputed master of continental Europe. The Corsican outsider had risen higher than any man since the Roman emperors. In the years that followed, Napoleon's power reached its peak. He seemed invincible. He defeated Prussia in a lightning campaign in 1806, shattering its army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. He occupied Berlin and humiliated the Prussian king. He fought the Russians again and finally forced them to make peace at the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. At a famous meeting on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander embraced and agreed to divide Europe between them. Napoleon controlled the west. Russia would dominate the east. Britain alone remained unconquered, protected by the sea and the Royal Navy. Unable to invade Britain, Napoleon tried to strangle it economically. He created the Continental System, a massive trade embargo designed to exclude British goods from Europe. Every country under French influence was forbidden from trading with Britain. Napoleon believed this would ruin the British economy and force them to make peace. But the system was a double-edged sword. It hurt European economies as much as it hurt Britain. It created smuggling and resentment, and it required Napoleon to constantly expand his empire to enforce it. Countries that tried to break the embargo were punished. Portugal, a longtime British ally, refused to comply. In 1807, Napoleon sent an army through Spain to conquer Portugal. This decision would lead to one of his greatest strategic mistakes. The invasion of Portugal required French troops to march through Spain. Napoleon soon decided to take over Spain as well. He forced the Spanish king to abdicate and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. Napoleon expected the Spanish people to accept this change quietly. He was terribly wrong. The Spanish rose up in a furious national revolt. The uprising was brutal and chaotic. French soldiers were ambushed and massacred. A new word entered the vocabulary of war: guerrilla, meaning little war. It described the hit-and-run tactics of the Spanish resistance fighters. Napoleon sent army after army into Spain to crush the rebellion, but they were swallowed up in a grinding, endless conflict. Britain saw its opportunity and landed an army in Portugal under a talented general named Sir Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington. For the next 6 years, the Peninsular War raged across Spain and Portugal. It became a constant drain on French resources and manpower, a bleeding ulcer, as Napoleon himself called it. The Spanish and Portuguese people, supported by British troops and gold, refused to give in. It was a war of sieges, ambushes, and atrocities on both sides. The conflict demonstrated the limits of Napoleonic power. He could win great battles, but he could not crush a people determined to resist. Even as he struggled in Spain, Napoleon faced a growing problem closer to home. He had no legitimate heir. His marriage to Josephine had produced no children. Napoleon was desperate for a son to carry on his dynasty and secure his legacy. After much agonising, he made the painful decision to divorce Josephine, the woman he had loved so passionately. The divorce was finalised in 1809. Napoleon then sought a new bride from one of the ancient royal houses of Europe. He eventually married Marie-Louise, an Archduchess of Austria and the daughter of Emperor Francis. It was a dynastic alliance designed to legitimise Napoleon's new empire and connect him to the oldest ruling families of Europe. In 1811, Marie-Louise gave Napoleon the son he craved. The boy was given the title King of Rome. Napoleon's dynasty seemed secure, but the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. The alliance with Russia had begun to crumble. Tsar Alexander was chafing under the continental system, which was ruining his country's economy. He began to quietly allow British goods to enter Russian ports. Napoleon viewed this as a betrayal. He decided that Russia must be punished and brought back into line. In the summer of 1812, he assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers from France and its allied states gathered in Poland. They came from every corner of Napoleon's empire. French, Germans, Italians, Poles and others. They were called the Grande Armée, and they were preparing to march into the vastness of Russia. The invasion began in June of 1812. Napoleon expected a quick campaign. He would march deep into Russia, force the Tsar's army to fight a decisive battle, defeat it, and dictate peace. But the Russians refused to cooperate. Instead of fighting, they retreated. They drew the Grande Armée deeper and deeper into the endless Russian heartland. As they retreated, they destroyed everything behind them, burning crops and villages in a scorched earth policy. The French army found itself marching through a wasteland with no food and no enemy to fight. Soldiers died not from battle, but from disease, exhaustion, and starvation. The supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles and collapsed. The immense army began to melt away. Finally, in September, the Russians turned to fight at the village of Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow. It was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. Both sides hurled themselves at each other in a brutal frontal assault. Tens of thousands of men were killed or wounded. There was no brilliant manoeuvre, just a terrible slaughter. In the end, the Russians withdrew, and Napoleon claimed victory. But it was a hollow triumph. The Russian army had not been destroyed. It retreated in good order, ready to fight again. Napoleon marched on to Moscow. When he arrived, he found the city empty. The population had fled. Then fires broke out across the city, set by the Russians themselves. Moscow, the ancient capital, burned for days. Napoleon waited in the ruins for the Tsar to surrender. The offer of peace never came. As autumn turned to winter, Napoleon faced a terrible choice. He could not stay in the burned-out shell of Moscow. His army was starving. He finally gave the order to retreat. The retreat from Moscow became one of the greatest disasters in military history. The Russian winter descended with savage fury. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Soldiers who had survived the march now faced blizzards, frostbite, and hypothermia. Cossack cavalry harried the retreating columns day and night. Horses died by the thousands. Men collapsed and froze to death in the snow. The bridges over rivers became scenes of panic and chaos as desperate soldiers fought to cross. Of the 600,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it out. The Grande Armée was destroyed. The catastrophe in Russia shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. His enemies smelled blood. Prussia, which had been crushed and humiliated, rose up in revolt against French domination. Austria, sensing the change in the wind, joined the new coalition. Russia pressed westward. Even the German states of the Confederation of the Rhine began to waver in their loyalty. Napoleon performed a miracle of organisation, raising a new army from the depleted manpower of France. He fought a brilliant campaign in Germany in 1813, winning several battles. But he was now facing overwhelming odds. In October of 1813, the Allied armies finally brought him to battle near the city of Leipzig. The Battle of Leipzig, also called the Battle of Nations, was the largest battle in history until the 20th century. Over 500,000 soldiers fought over 4 days. Napoleon was defeated and forced to retreat. His German allies deserted him on the battlefield. His empire east of the Rhine collapsed. Napoleon retreated into France with the remnants of his army. The Allied forces invaded from the east. The campaign of France in 1814 saw Napoleon at his most brilliant and desperate. He was outnumbered and outgunned, facing multiple enemy armies converging on Paris. He struck at them one by one with the speed and cunning he had shown in Italy nearly 20 years before. He won a string of small victories that amazed even his enemies. But it was not enough. The Allies were too many. Paris fell in March of 1814. Napoleon's own marshals, exhausted and seeing no hope, refused to continue fighting. They confronted him and demanded he abdicate. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte signed the Act of Abdication. He was no longer Emperor of the French. The Allied powers, in a gesture of surprising generosity, exiled him to the small island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. He was allowed to keep the title of Emperor and given sovereignty over the tiny island. It was a gilded cage. Napoleon arrived on Elba and set about governing his miniature kingdom with the same energy he had applied to France. He reorganised the island's finances, improved its roads, and even built a small navy. But he watched events on the mainland with keen interest. France was now ruled by a restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, the brother of the king who had been executed during the Revolution. The new king was unpopular. The French people missed the glory of the Napoleonic era. The soldiers of the old Grande Armée were restless and idle. Napoleon sensed an opportunity. In February of 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba. He landed on the southern coast of France with about 1,000 loyal followers. It was an insane gamble. He was one man against a kingdom. King Louis sent an army to arrest him, but as Napoleon marched north towards Paris, something extraordinary happened. The soldiers sent to stop him refused to fire. They rallied to their old emperor. Regiment after regiment defected to his side. When he reached the town of Grenoble, the gates were thrown open by cheering crowds. By the time he reached Paris, he was at the head of an army. King Louis fled the capital in the night. Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace in triumph on March 20th, 1815. He was emperor once more. This astonishing comeback lasted 100 days. The Allied powers were not amused. They declared Napoleon an outlaw and a disturber of world peace. They assembled massive armies to crush him once and for all. Napoleon knew he had to act fast, before the full weight of the coalition could be brought against him. His best chance was to strike at the Allied armies gathering in Belgium and defeat them one by one before they could unite. In June of 1815, he led his rebuilt army north across the border. He faced two main enemies, a Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher and a mixed Allied army under the Duke of Wellington, the hero of the Peninsular War. Napoleon's initial moves were brilliant. He caught the Allies by surprise and interposed his army between them, preventing them from joining forces. On June 16th, he defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny and believed he had knocked them out of the campaign. He sent a corps under Marshal Grouchy to pursue the retreating Prussians. He then turned his main force to confront Wellington. The two armies met on June 18th, 1815, near a small village in Belgium. Its name was Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo began late in the morning after a night of heavy rain. Wellington had positioned his army on a ridge behind a sunken road, a strong defensive position. Napoleon launched a series of massive infantry and cavalry assaults against the Allied line. The fighting was ferocious. French cavalry charged again and again up the muddy slopes against the disciplined British infantry squares. Wellington's men held firm, but they were being ground down. The battle hung in the balance. Napoleon needed his forces to be enough. He kept looking to the east, expecting Grouchy to arrive and deliver the final blow. But it was not Grouchy who appeared on the eastern horizon. It was the Prussians. Blücher had not been destroyed at Ligny. He had rallied his army and marched through the mud to join Wellington. Prussian troops began arriving on Napoleon's right flank in the late afternoon. Napoleon was now fighting on two fronts. In a final desperate gamble, he sent his elite Imperial Guard, the veterans who had never been defeated, in one last assault on the Allied centre. The Guard advanced up the slope in perfect order, but they were met by a devastating volley of musket fire. For the first and only time in their history, the Imperial Guard broke and retreated. The cry went up across the French lines. The Guard is falling back. Panic spread. The French army collapsed and fled the field. Wellington and Blücher met on the battlefield at dusk and embraced. The Napoleonic era was over. Napoleon fled back to Paris, but there was nothing left to fight for. He abdicated for the second time on June 22, 1815. He hoped to escape to America and start a new life. But the British Navy blocked every port. He finally surrendered himself to the captain of a British warship, throwing himself on the mercy of his oldest and most determined enemy. The British government had no intention of being merciful a second time. They decided to send Napoleon far, far away, to a place from which there could be no escape. His final prison was the island of St. Helena, a tiny volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, over 1,000 miles from the nearest land. It was one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. Napoleon arrived in October of 1815. He would spend the last 6 years of his life there, a prisoner under the watchful eye of a British governor. He lived in a damp and uncomfortable farmhouse called Longwood. He passed his days reading, dictating his memoirs, and complaining bitterly about his treatment. He was accompanied by a small group of loyal followers who shared his exile. On St. Helena, Napoleon crafted the final version of his own legend. He presented himself as a champion of the ideals of the French Revolution, a liberator of peoples, a man who had been brought down by the jealousy and treachery of the old monarchies of Europe. He downplayed his tyranny and his wars of aggression. He created the myth of the Napoleonic legend, an image that would inspire revolutionaries and nationalists for generations to come. It was perhaps his greatest propaganda victory. Napoleon's health declined steadily during his years of exile. He suffered from chronic stomach pain. On May 5, 1821, at the age of only 51, Napoleon Bonaparte died. The official cause was stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his father. But for years, rumours persisted that he had been slowly poisoned by arsenic. Modern analysis of samples of his hair has shown elevated levels of arsenic, though whether this was from poison, medicine, or the arsenic-laced wallpaper in his room remains a subject of debate. He was buried on St. Helena. His body was later returned to France in 1840 and interred with great ceremony in a magnificent tomb at Les Invalides in Paris, where it remains to this day. What then is the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte? It is a question that historians still debate. He was a brilliant military commander, perhaps the greatest in European history. His campaigns are still studied in military academies around the world, but his wars cost the lives of millions of soldiers and civilians. He spread the ideas of the French Revolution across Europe, abolishing feudalism and establishing legal equality in many of the lands he conquered. But he also established an autocratic dictatorship that crushed political freedom at home. He created the modern French state, reformed its laws, its education, and its administration. But he also reimposed slavery in the French colonies and persecuted those who opposed him. Perhaps the most lasting part of his legacy is the Napoleonic Code. It became the model for legal systems in dozens of countries, from Europe to Latin America to Louisiana. Its principles of equality before the law and the protection of private property shaped the legal foundations of the modern world. His reorganisation of Europe, particularly in Germany and Italy, helped set in motion the forces that would eventually lead to the unification of those nations. He redrew the map of Europe, and the aftershocks of his conquest shaped the continent for a century after his death. Napoleon himself understood the power of his own story. In his final days on St. Helena, he said that what would survive him was not his battles or his conquests, but his civil code. He was right. The code outlived the empire. But so did the legend. The image of the little Corsican who rose to dominate Europe, who crowned himself emperor and conquered from Madrid to Moscow, only to be brought down and exiled to a lonely rock in the ocean, is one of the most compelling stories in all of history. It is a tale of ambition, genius, hubris, and tragedy. It is the story of a man who believed he could master destiny, and who, for a time, came terrifyingly close to succeeding. The world Napoleon left behind was forever changed. The old order of hereditary kings and nobles, which had seemed so permanent, had been shaken to its core. The ideas of nationalism and popular sovereignty, which he had both championed and suppressed, would reshape Europe in the century to come. The memory of his Grande Armée marching under the tricolour flag would inspire future generations of revolutionaries and nation-builders. The shadow of his ambition would hang over Europe for 100 years, as the great powers struggled to create a balance that would prevent another man from ever again rising to such dominance. Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of the most controversial and fascinating figures in history. He was a product of the Enlightenment and the Revolution, a man who believed in reason and progress. He was also a tyrant who plunged an entire continent into decades of war. He was loved and hated in equal measure during his lifetime, and he remains so today. But one thing is certain. The boy from the small island of Corsica, who was mocked for his accent and his poverty, rose to become the master of Europe. He proved that in an age of revolution, a single individual, armed with talent and ambition, could change the world. As we drift off to sleep tonight, we can reflect on the improbable journey of Napoleon Bonaparte. From the sunlit shores of Corsica to the frozen wastes of Russia, from the splendour of the Tuileries to the lonely exile of St. Helena, his life was an epic of triumph and disaster. He was a man of boundless energy and endless contradictions. He freed and he enslaved. He built and he destroyed. He was loved as a liberator and feared as a tyrant. His story is a reminder that history is not made by abstract forces alone, but by individuals of extraordinary will and ambition. And sometimes those individuals emerge from the most unlikely places. The Corsican artillery officer who became emperor is gone, but his legend endures. The tomb of Napoleon at Les Invalides is visited by millions each year. They come to pay their respects to a man who, for better or for worse, left an indelible mark on our world. The eagles of the Grande Armée have long since fallen silent. The drums of Austerlitz and Waterloo have faded into silence. But the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, the impossible rise and the tragic fall, continues to captivate us, a testament to the heights of human ambition and the depths of human folly. And so, the Lion of France sleeps beneath the dome of gold and the world remembers.